The darkness inside the fortified livestock barn was not merely an absence of light. It was a physical, crushing weight that pressed against the chest and suffocated the lungs. The bitter, shrieking wind of November 1888 held through the warped, unchanked pine slats of the high roof, driving microscopic shards of ice through the drafts. The air was thick and foul, choking the throat with the intense, eye-watering stench of concentrated ammonia, frozen horse manure, and wet, rotting straw. In the furthest, deepest store, a heavy oak enclosure built to contain violent, unbroken stallions, sat Nellie. She was 21 years old. The severe, gaunt highs of her cheeks and the bruised, exhausted purple shadows beneath her eyes made her look like a fragile, hollowed-out ghost. She was indentured scorie, legally bound to a sprawling, corrupt restaurant. Her life measured only in the endless, back-breaking hours of scrubbing lye into raw floorboards and holding freezing water from the valley creek. But the physical labor had never broken her. What broke her was the smooth, unmarked mound of frozen dirt sitting roughly a mile away the Ban Ridge. Her 6-year-old brother, little Toss, had contracted the winter fever 4 days ago. He had copped into his tiny, fragile ribs bruised, and skin radiating a terrifying, unnatural heat. Nellie had begged for a doctor. She had fallen to her knees in the mud of the ranch yard and pleaded with Abner Vance for a single wagon in an hour of his time. Abner had singly stumped around her, complaining the noise was upsetting his prized thoroughbred mares. Toss had died shivering in the dark of the unheated servants' quarters, clutching Nellie's raw, calloused hand into his smooth fingers fondly wenching Charlie Slart. When they buried him in the frozen clay, nully and wet. She had broken down while milking the cows the following dawn, a profound, gut-wrenching wail of absolute, shattering grief that echoed through the timber rafters. Abner Vance despised the sound of human weakness. He views indented workers not grieving souls, but as livestock need to be disciplined when they start down to line. He had dragged Nellie by the collar of her threadbare burlap dress, hauled her across the freezing wall of the yard, and thrown her violently into the pitch-dark stattering stall. He dropped a massive, heavy iron padlock over the outside latch. He told her she could come out when she learned to suffer in absolute silence. That was 3 days ago. Nellie had been locked in a freezing, pitch-black cage for some 2 hours, thus a drop of water or crust of stale bread. A severe dehydration had thick her blood, making her heart hammer slide, terrifiedly shrill as her ribs. The brutal, sub-zero cold had seeped deeply into her bone marrow. Her arms were numb, the fingertips tearing a dangerous, bruised bow. She huddled in the first corner of the store, her knees pulled tightly to her shivering chest. The physical agony of the freezing temperatures was entirely eclipsed by the crushing, suffocating weight of her grief. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Tones's bare veins. She saw the empty, free and dirt. If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. A violent, full-weight tremor rocked her fragile frame. She caught tighter into the filthy, soiled store, seeking in microscopic shredded worn. A sewer ragged, whose sorptory swape her dry, running through it. The hot tears spill over her dark eyes, tracking down her filthy cheeks, only to instantly freeze into jagged, biting tracks of ice against her pale skin. She was wheezing the will to draw another agonizing, freezing breath. Outside the hee-hee, fortified barn doors, the howling blare temporarily masked the rhythmic, earth-shaking crunch of massive loos churning the deep snow. A heavy logging sled, loaded high with precisely spite-seasoned cornwheat, pulled into the right yard. It was drawn by a mixed pair of colossal, heavily muscled Percheron draft horses, their massive chests steaming in the freezing gale. Leading in by Frickler the trace chain was a giant. Gayan, the ward, crossed to not look like a man. He the walking, breathing extension of the jagged, unforgiving mountain peaks. He stood well over 6.5 feet tall, as uncurrently broad-shouldered as a massive chest draped in the thick, frosted hides of mass and wools and heavy ganglis. Under the wide-brimmed his snow-gate hat, his face was a terrifying landscape of hardened, weather lines, covered by a thick, dark beard. But the most striking, terrifying feature of the mountain man was a thick, jagged, violently raised scar that slashed directly across the front of his throat. It was a gruesome old wound that had completely severed his vocal cords years ago. Cain was entirely, pondly mute. He communicated only through the outward, terrifying force of his thick presence. He secured the heavy horses to the iron hitching post. Usually, the quiet, dark-haired girl with the sad eyes, the one who always sneaked his horses weed up when the form was licking, would cart aside ledger for the winter timber. Cain's pale, amber eyes scanned the freezing, deserted yard. She was not there. The heavy, parched oak door of the main ranch house opened. Adnevent stick down to the coat post, wearing luxurious fur-lined wall coat and puffing lazily on an expensive imported cigar. The rich, suede smell of tobacco cut sharply through the freezing air. Dropped the coat by the main sir, cross, Abner backed to the wind, gesturing lazily with his gloved hand. And be quick about it. The storm's getting worse, and I'm not paying the standing lawn yard. Gideon didn't nod. His amber eyes remained fixed of the main house, and so he dragged toward the massive, heavily padlocked doors of the livestock barn. Over the shaking howl of the blizzard, Gideon's highly attuned predator's hearing caught something. It was faint. It was incredibly weak. A low, hoarse, broken sob echoing from deep in the heavy timber walls of the barn. Gideon's massive frame went entirely, terrifyingly rigid. He slowly turned his head, his pale eyes looking directly onto Evan Vance on the porch. Ogden noticed the giant's intense, unblinking stare. The ranchon frowned, let out a careless dismissal of the pot of thick-clad blue cigar smoke into the air. Don't mind the noise from the barn, course. It's just the scullery me. The little brat wouldn't stop bowing over and dud runs on the poor. Spooked my best marriage. On that turn the dot freeze go to break a habit. She'll come out when she learns to keep her mouth shut. Gideon did not speak. He did not growl. He did not show his teeth. The furl absolute wrath that ignited within his messy chest was silent, blind inferno. He turned his back on Agna. He walked on Akitu's heavy logging sled. He mounted winds for Lenger. He reached down to add the leather loops as part to joint his masset double-bitted iron fillets. The heavy ash handle was 3 feet long, polished smooth by years of brutal labor, and the twin blades of the heavy iron head were filed to a razor-sharp, lethal edge. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" Abner shouted, his arrogant smirk faltering as the towering giant marched deliberately past the cordwood and directly toward the locked barn. "Get away from my property, you mute savage." Gideon knew the wealthy tyrant completely. He reached the massive, heavy oak doors of the barn. He saw the thick, rusted iron padlock securing a steel house. Gideon planted his heavy, iron-shod boots into the deep, churned snow. He gripped the thick ash handle of the axe with both his massive, heavily cast hands. He drew the heavy iron head back over his broad shoulder, torn every single arms of his massive, terrifying strain, and swung. Crack! The sound of the impact was utterly deafening, a violent explosion of kinetic force that rivaled the cannon shot. The heavy iron blade of the felling axe bit completely through the thick oak planting, striking the heavy steel hasp directly behind it. The padlock then just braked. It completely shattered, exploding into a sharp, jagged, twisting metal shrapnel that buried itself into the frozen mud. Gideon didn't stop. He wrenched the heavy axe free and delivered the second, brutal, horizontal blow directly to the center of the heavy doors. The massive oak timbers violently splintered, the heavy iron hinges growing and screaming as the doors were completely, utterly obliterated, blasted inward off their frames. The freezing wind rushed into the dark, ammonia-choked cavern. Gideon stacked over the shattered, splintered ruins of the doors, his amber eyes adjusting to the pitch-black interior. He walked down the center aisle, ignoring the panic nicking of the thoroughbreds, until he reached the final stalling store. He looked down into the filthy, freezing dirt. Nellie was curled into her tight, shivering paw in the soiled straw. Her lips are terrifying, bruised shade of blue, eyes belly open, complete and focused, gazed with the lethal grit hypothermia. She looked down the towering, messy Silas friend in the doorway, too weak to even flinch away from the terrifying dirt opened yet. Geen dirt the mussy thing into the dirt. The pharaoh wrath in his eyes instantly dissolved into a profound, agonizing sorrow. He dropped to his knees in the freezing, soiled straw. He reached out with hands rough enough to crush stone. He touched her with shocking, breathtaking gentleness. He shrugged out his massive, incredibly thick fur coat. He wrapped the heavy, lesuis pelt in pewy round days fat down, freezing frown, cocooning tightly. He slid his thick arms beneath her back and her knees, and scooped her up from the dirt as effortlessly as if she weighed no more than a bundle of dry lavender. He carried her out of the suffocating dark of the barn, stepping back out into the blinding, howling blizzard of the yard. Adna Vance had drawn silver-plated revolver, his face pale with a mixture of outrage and absolute terror as the giant emerged from the ruined barn carrying the go. "Put her down, Cross. She's bound to this ranch by law. You are stealing my property." Gideon had not stopped his long, heavy strides. He walked directly to the terrified, shouting man. When he was 10 feet away, Gideon stopped. He lay securely against a broad, heat-radiating chest with one massive arm. With his free hand, he reached my belay brought a waist. He brought free, thick, heavy leather pouch. With a violent, sapping flea of his thick wrist, Gideon held the pouch directly into the freezing mud at Abner's polished leather boots. The heavy bat struck their foot and earth with a dense, metallic thud. The joystrings burst open, spun dozens of heavy, raw knots of unrefined mountain suva into the dirty slush. It was a staggering fortune, pulled directly from the hidden, high-altitude bedrock. It was 10 times the price at an indentured project. Gideon looked directly into Abner's terrified eyes. He pointed a massive, thick finger at the silver in the mud, then pointed directly at Nellie, resting against his chest. His absolute, terrifying sounds conveyed a message clear the spoken threat. The debt is paid. If he falls, I will use the axe on your skull. Gideon turned his massive back on the ruined barn and the greedy, staring ranch owner. He carried Nellie to his masted drag fluis, securing it gently into the broad leather saddle, completely enveloped in the heavy wolf fur. He swung behind her, his broad chest acting as impenetrable wall heat against her freezing back. As the messy beast surged forward, tearing away from corrupt valley and hand directly toward the jagged, freeling, invasual spine the Maltese, Nellie clutched the heavy fear tightly. She was under the thieving thaw, for the absolutely paralyzing terror made. The sound, feral giant had just bought her, and she was being carried completely out of the known world, up into the terrifying, isolated keep of the mountain's phantom. That phantom did not ride like a mortal man. He navigated the treacherous, sheer drop-offs of the jagged mountain spine with a terrifying, absolute certainty, entirely unbothered by the howling, blinding whiteout that threatened to sweep them off the narrow switchbacks and into the black abyss below. Nellie sat rigidly sideways in the broad leather saddle, her fragile, underfed frame completely swelled by the immense, crushing weight of the grizzly and warth furs Gideon had wrapped her in. The altitude made the air punishingly thin, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of crushed ice, ozone, and the rich, heavy pine resin that clung to the giant's canvas coat. The bitter cold of the blizzard was malicious, seeking out the edges of the heavy pelt to bite at her exposed, bruised ankles. But the true ankle keeping her tethered to the living world was the towering mountain of a man seated directly behind her. Gideon Cross was a silent, impenetrable furnace of dense muscle and heavy lead. His massive, broad chest acted as a flawless windbreak against the helling gale, and the thick, unyielding arm he kept wrapped securely around her waist was a rigid, immovable bar of iron, keeping her from slipping off the exhausted draught horse. He did not speak a single word. He did not urge the massive pressure on Foster. He simply endured the punishing urns, a natural, breathing extension of the brittle, strong-shrouded cracks. Just as the deepest, most agonizing ache of the freezing cold threatened to entirely consume Nellie's numb, bruised blue fingers, the massive draft horse crested a steep ridge of solid, black obsidian rock and let out a heavy, vibrating snot of exhausted steam. Emerging from the drying squall was a fortress unlike anything Ellie had ever seen. It was not a crude timber trapper's shack built upon the mountain. It was born directly off of it. The massive home was constructed into the gaping, natural moor of a deep granite cave system. The front facade was built of incredibly thick, unpeeled spruce logs and heavy, mortared fieldstone, sealing cabin for the owns. It squatted low against the of a dark, brooding, heavily fortified monument to profound, unyielding desolation. Gideon swung his massive leg over a saddle and dropped to the earth. His heavy, iron-shelled boobs sit in the deep snow with offensive, crunching sad. He reached up, his heavily calloused hands completely spaying her small waist, and let her from the saddle with a shocking, breathtaking ease, as the grueling, freeing ride cost him absolutely no physical exertion. The moment her ruined, threadbare boots touched the porch, he released her, taking rapid, hair set backward as a fragile touch had burned him. He pushed the heavy, iron-bound oak door open. Nellie swallowed the thick, suffocating knot of terror in her throat and stepped over the threshold. The cavernous interior smelled intensely, tread time, deep wood ash, ancient, damp stone, and a profound, echoing loneliness. Gideon struck a lucifer match against the heavy doorframe, lighting kerosene lanting nine for the massive, exposed, searing joist. The dim, flickering air light revealed a nest of space. The bed walls were soiled, unhewn granite, glistening slightly with microscopic frost. A heavy stone hearth, wine to roast an entire deer, dominated the center of the room, choked with cold, gray ash. In the deepest core of the cave sat a massive bed frame built from thick birch branches, piled 3 feet deep with incredibly thick, luxurious skins of buffalo and timber walls. King of motley cover, he moved a heavy, deliberate grace, kneeling for the massive stone hearth. Within minutes, he had built a roaring, fiercely hot fire from dry pine splits and heavy oak logs, driving the damp, oppressive cold entirely from the stone keep. He fetched a small, heavy iron pot from a recessed shelf in the rock, filled it with snow, and placed it directly over the blazing coals. When it boiled, he added a thick chunk of salted, cured venison and a handful of dried herbs. He poured the rich, steaming bone broth into a heavy tin cup and carried it to where Nellie sat shivering on a heavy timber bench. He pressed the hot tin to her raw, freezing hands. The heat radiated violently into her numb fingers, a stark, painful contrast to the biting cold. But as she drank the rich, life-saving broth, a different, far more agonizing cold seized her chest. Gideon sat across the ring on a low wooden stool, his face heavily shadowed by the brim of his hat. The dancing orange firelight violently illuminated the thick, jagged, horrific scar slashing completely across his throat. He was entirely mute. He communicated only vise, having just alliterated heavy outdoors and steel paddle by the seggle swing of his axe. If I cry, he would throw me by to the heart, Nay thought, a son biting Pat seizing her launt. The brief for her ill brother, Tars, was a jagged, physical rock lodged in her windpipe, begging to be released in a chattering wail. But she remembered Abner Vance's cruel face. She remembered the pitch-black, freezing Emongecho Torsto. She stared at the Jan's terrible scarring and tallies understood his signs. She saw he despised the sound of weakness just as much as the wealthy Roger did. Nellie Begdeen sat of her ring cheek until she tasted in a hot, sharp tang copper blade. She forced the tears violently down, swallowing her gut-wrenching grief with a sheer, desperate terror, refusing to let a single, pathetic whimper escape her lips. When she faced her breath, Gideon stayed up. He pointed a massive, thick finger toward the heavy bed fizz in the core. Then he grabbed a single, thin, moth-eaten wool blanket from a wooden chest, lay directly across the freezing, draughty stern floor directing for to the heavy iron-bound door, and lay down. He gave her the absolute warmth and comfort of the heart, taking the freezing dirt in the role of the ultimate guard dog for himself. But his physical distance was a wall thicker than the grat enclosing them. When Nellie walked the next morn, the fire had been stoked into a roaring blaze, but the giant was completely gone. The shrieking blizzard was still raging outside, battering the hay spruce logs. Nellie sat up, her joints aching deeply from the hypothermia she'd brennacethanked. Shield the rant immense in Clantstone Keep. That appends then of the oak table and the bows gains disguised work gear, a heavy canvas duster and thick canvas trousers. They were completely frozen, stiff as wooden boards, and heavily caked in old, blackened animal blood, thick pine pitch, and deeply ground in mountain mud. Melly stared at the ruined gear. She was an indentured scullery maid. She had spent her entire youth performing backbreaking, invisible labor for ungrateful tyrants. "I will not be a helpless, weeping burden," she vowed to the antique cave, her jaw setting in a firm, unbreakable line of absolute iron resolve. "He pulled me from the dog. I will earn my warmth." She forced her exhausted, aching body to move. She found a massive tin washbasin and filled it at snipe for the windowsill, swinging the heavy kettle that as part of the fire. When the water reached a roaring, furious boil, she poured into the basin iron thick cake ash, lime-based modern soap. She submerged the freezing, stiff canvas gear into the scalding, soapy water. The physical agony of the chore was blinding. The harsh line daily burned in microscopic cuts and raw blisters under freezing hands, sting like a swarm of angry wasps. The heavy, wet canvas was incredibly dense, resisting her every movement. But Nellie gritted her teeth, ignoring the throbbing pain, in scrub. She threw her entire, meager upper body weight into the heavy washboard, systematically stripping the black blood, the grease, and the dirt from the heavy fabric until the water turned a murky, dark brown. She wrung the heavy garments out with trembling, violently aching arms, and hung them over a heavy wooden drying rack directly in front of the bleeding eye. But she didn't stop there. In a small, heavy wooden box on the mantelpiece, she found his crude sewing kit. She threaded a thick, heavy bone needle with dark, waxed animal sinew. Sitting entirely cross-legged on the swept-stone floor, she pulled the drying canvas onto her lap and began to mend a mossy, jagged tease the deep-tinner brush had ripped into his gear. Her fingers, which Emma Vance had deemed useless, made with a barf-tacking, practiced, intricate efficiency. She drew dozens of tight, meticulous, panthy spaced stingers, reinforcing the heavy seams with absolute material care that the solitary giant had clearly lacked for decades. Deep in the back to the cage cistern, where the natural ambient temperature is a freezing root cellar, she found his larder. She hoed out a fully dressed, frozen winter hare, wild root vines, and dried mountain carrots. Ye heavier and cleaver, she jerked the meaty vegetables, rendering down a piece of sorted pork fat and that's her heavy cast iron Dutch oven to create a rich, savory base. By the time the heavy oak door finally rattled violently on its iron hinges hours later, the stone keep had fundamentally, entirely transformed. Kean burst into the rain with a violent gust of blinding white snow, carrying a bundle with heavy steel traps of his massive showed. He was a abominable snowman, his dark bee entirely completely frozen inside in thick, heavy icicles. He kicked the door shut, leaning his massive weight against it to draw the heavy iron bar into place, expecting the cold, empty, dead silence of a cave that had not felt the touch of a woman in 30 years. He stopped completely dead in his tracks. The air was blazing, wonderfully hot. The absolute, of warming, mouth-watering roan of roasting rabbit stew and wild hinds hitting a physical, staggering blow to the chest, masking the fade smat of whetstone and oscillation. And that, standing by the blazing stone hearth, holding heavy wooden spoon, was Nellie. Gideon slowly let the heavy steel traps slip from his massive shoulder. They hit the stone floor with a loud, ringing plane. He stripped off his soaked, fringing leather guns. He walked slowly to the center of the room, his heavy boots silent of the sweat stole. He ate the bubbling, rich stew. He lifted the heavy drying rack. His canvas gear was not merely clean. It was entirely meticulously restored, the massive tears sewn shut with a powdered, beautiful precision that spoke of profound, undeniable care. He looked at her. He knew the sheer, mind-numbing physical agony he would have taken freezing out go to scrub heavy canvas with brain-like soap, and the intense, focused patience required to push a hay-bone needle through thick that cuff. He had expected to be huddled in the dark quad, untied paralyzed by the tron de bond and lice of her broor. She had wept. She had forcefully, beautifully commanded his chaotic, freezing world. Gain stared down on her, his pale amber eyes locking onto her wide, exhausted gaze. The terrifying, frail mask of the mute-maned beast cracked entirely, revealing profound, silent, earth-shattering awe underneath. He didn't see a broken, handless, indented maid. He saw a Sviatic forced and absolute, unbreakable iron, who possessed a coiled, fierce dignity infinitely stronger than the cruel men who had locked her in the dark. The silence that stretched across the sweltering, violet cavern was no longer a heavy, suffocating threat. It was a profound, vibrating shock. Adrian did not issue a wrath command or cast a dismissive scowl. He moved with a slow, deliberate reverence, walking to the heavy oak table and picking at the heavy tin ball rivets to share protein. He ate with the starving, desperate intensity of a man who had survived and trod meat and bitter coffee for decades. But his movements were quiet, deeply respectful. He did not devour the meal like a feral beast. He said like a holy sacrament, his amber eyes tracking her across the firelight with a quiet, absolute gratitude. Despite the warmth of the roaring stone hearth and the undeniable safety of the heavily fortified keep, Nellie remained crisper voluntarily. Next week, as the brittle outer winter tined its freeing grip on the jagged peaks, she moved through a cavern like a fragile, silent ghost. She performed her chores with meticulous perfection, terrified that any mistake, any loud noise, or any display of the suffocating, agonizing grief still tearing at her chest would result in the giant dragging her out into the snow. The memory of Abner Vance locking her in the pitch-black stallion stool for weeping over her dead brother was a permanent, branding iron pressed against her mind. With the memory of little Thomas's cold, lifeless hand gripped her heart, Nellie would violently bite the inside of her cheek, swallowing the thick, burning knot of tears until her throat was raw and bleeding, absolutely refusing to let Gideon hear a single sob. She believed she was hiding her agony perfectly. She did not know that the solemn, watchful giant saw every single swallow tear, every flinch, and every terrified, white-knuckled grip she took on the edge of the oak trail. The Frodro sound where Tina had built was roaringly obliterated on the morning of their 8th day in the gate. The barometric pressure plummeted so rapidly that the very air inside the cabin felt thin and bruised. The sky beyond the heavy spruce door turned sickly, bruised purple, and then the secondary blizzard hit. It was not merely snow. It was a shrieking, horizontal deluge of solid, heavy ice, blinding white air conditions that dropped the temperature to 30 degrees below zero. The massive ancient pines outside shrieked and spun and possible cushion weight in the gale. They were running dangerously low on high-fat meat, an absolute necessity for surviving the deep freeze. Gideon did not hesitate. He geared up in his knee-mended canvas, grabbed his heavy buffalo rifle, and vashed into the screaming white void, leaving Nellie to tend the fire. He was gone for 14 agonizing hours. When the heavy oak door fatally burst open, carried inward by violent, shrieking gust of freezing wind, Gideon did not step over the threshold with his easel, terrifying, fluid grace. He staggered. He was dragging the massive, 600-pound carcass of the boy oak by thick harness wrapped entirely around his massive chest. He hunted the beast deep in the timbering, befeeling them starving stew, at who the incredibly heavy, dead weight through miles of waist-deep, freezing drift snow. Greying drift the heel highs just inside the door. He took 2 blind, dragging steps toward the roaring height, his pale amber eyes completely unfocused, the pupils dilated to thin, terrified pinpricks. The sheer, monumental physical exertion in the lethal cold had utterly destroyed him. His knees simply ceased to flinch him. The towering 260-pound giant crashed heavily onto the swept stone floor, his massive frame shaking with a violent, terrifying, full-body rigor. Nellie leaped from the timber pit, her heart seizing with the pure, unadulterated pang. She rushed to his side, dropping to her knees on the hard stone. She grabbed the corn his heavy canvas coat he aimed to happen. The sight made the breath completely her lungs in a quiet, horrified rush. The heavy leather ass had violently torn the massive muscles across his chest and shoulders. The ski was simply muttered who horrifying, deep-dropping and dark-drusen. The muscle fibers literally shone from the shoe, impossible strain the draught. But worse was the cold. Gideon's thick, calloused fingers were waxy, terrifying, translucent white. The very tips began to turn dangerous, neck-utter black. He was suffering from severe, advanced frostbite, and the exhaustion had plunged him into lethal, shock-induced hypothermia. Nay, did not freeze the cold to dull haystacks. The world had just spent a week nursing a dying child through a lethal fever past a brutal, hard-earned knowledge of exactly how fragile the human body was. She humed with an absolute, terrifying efficiency. She knew the plunging footpad and hands directly into hot water would cause the frozen cells to violently burst, ensuring amputation of his fingers. She fetched the Zen wash basin and filled it with tepid, lukewarm water. She dragged his massive, shuddering upper body closer to the radiant heat of the hearth, and knowing the swimming protest of her own underfed muscles. She submerged his massive, waxy hands into the lukewarm basin, using her own soft, calloused thumbs to apply incredibly gentle, rhythmic friction to his blackened fingertips, slowly, painstakingly coaxing the freezing, sluggish blood back into the dying tissue. Gideon let out a muffled, guttural groan of absolute, blinding agony as the sensation returned, a sensation that felt like his hands were being plunged into boiling glass. But Nellie did not stop. She gritted her teeth, ignoring his groans, and worked the dying flesh until the dangerous white waxy texture faded into an angry, inflamed red. For 48 straight hours, Nellie did not sleep. She stayed awake, her own eyes bruised and bloodshot, listening to the shrieking blizzard patter the heavy spruce logs. She boiled willow bark and wild mint into her dark, pungent tea, trickling it down his throat to fight the violent fever that had set into his strong, ruined chest muscles. Treat his smooth, heavy riverstones directly in the gone coals, red and tidy in thick wool rags, a patter the wrecky gas the sprue, that his armpits haggis is grown, to drag the lethal, freezing chill from his organs. She sat entirely cross-legged on the hard stone floor, his massive, sweat-dampened head resting heavily in her lap, her bruised fingers constantly stroking his dark, wildly tangled hair to soothe his thrusting delirium. On the evening of the third day, the violent shivering finally stopped. The deep, rattling wheeze in his massive chest smoothed into a heavy, rhythmic rumble. Gideon opened his eyes. The intense, burning delirium was completely gone. He felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the buffalo furs, the dull, deep, throbbing agony in his torn chest muscles, and the astonishing, overwhelming heat radiating from the hot stones packed around him. He turned his hat slowly, his neck stiff and aching. Nellie was sitting slumped against the base of the massive sting hive. She was entirely exhausted, her face pale, her dark hair falling loosely round her shoulders. But her eyes were open, watching him with a fierce, protective vigilance. However, the sheer, crushing exhaustion had completely eroded the iron wall she had built around her own grief. She was staring brandly into the dancing orange flames, and a single, heavy tear softly tracking down her pale cheek. She reached up with a trembling hand, violently scrubbing the tear away, her breath hitching a stifled, terrified gasp as she realized it was a weed, instantly terrified he would be unread her weeping. Gideon did not look around. He saw the sheer, unadulterated terror in her eyes, the terror of a girl who had been locked in the dark for having a human heart. He shifted his massive weight, pushing himself up slightly in his bruised, aching elbow. He reached his large, heavily calloused right hand out from beneath the high furs. He didn't issue a harsh gesture. He tenderly caught her trailing wrist, pulling her hand away from her tear-streaked face. Gideon looked darkly into her wide, terrified eyes. Sly, deliberately, he pressed her small, calloused palm directly against his own throat. He guided her fingertips to trace the thick, jagged, horrific scar that slashed completely across his vocal cords. Nellie's breath cords. The scar was hard, comprised of deeply raised, violently tissue. It was not the clean, surgical cut of a blade. It was a brittle, jagged tear. Gideon held her hand there for a long, heavy moment. Then he released her. He reached her to the edge of the hearth and picked up a thick, cold piece of black charcoal from the sweat stone. He leaned forward, his massive chest heaving the effort, and pressed the charcoal gently against the smooth, fat stone between them. His ruthless, sir, he leered. A horse sir, the bird word echo gnarly in the quiet cavern. He wrote 4 words in bark, jagged letters, my father's root cellar. Nellie stared at the words, her brow following in confusion. Gideon met her gaze, his amber eyes swinging with a profound, earth-shattering agony. He pressed the charcoal to the stone again, writing blue the first line. I was 8. I cried in the dark. He paused, his massive hand trembling slightly, the dull power of physical weight in sweltering air. He drew the follow line, underlying the brutal slash of the black charcoal. He cut my throat to make me quiet. Nellie froze, the breath leaving her lungs in a quiet, devastated rush. The charcoal sucked from Gideon's thick fingers, hitting stone foe a dull clink. The foul iteration, the heady fang acts, a terrifying manipulation, and the throat terrifying strides, a with hatred of the wild. It was absolute, crushing torment. The giant before I had not merely witnessed her abuse, he had lit it. He had been locked in a dark, freezing box by an abusive tyrant, just as she had. But when he had wept for mercy in the pitch-black cellar, his father had violently taken his voice for air. He hadn't axed the heavy oak doors of the barn down because he wanted to purchase a scullery maid. He had destroyed the cage because the sound of a barking, muffled sobbing in the dark had been the exact echo of his unjudged tyrant. He didn't despise her tease. He understood that with absolute, blood-soaked intimacy. Oh, Ian, Nellie whispered, the words breaking on a jagged, shattering sob. The iron dam she had built to by her Greek compete utterly disintegrated. The suffocating terror of the advance washed away, replaced by an overwhelming, concealed tide soul of her little blood, in a profound, aching empathy for the book and giant who essayed her. She did not bite her cheek. She did not swallow her pain. Nellie collapsed forward, burying her face directly into the thick, heavy canvas of Gideon's chest, and she finally, truly wept. She wailed for little Thomas, she cried for the freezing barn, and she cried for the 8-year-old boy who had lost his voice in the dark. Gideon did not push her away. He did not flinch from her weakness. He wrapped his massive, heavy arms completely around her trembling shoulders, burying his bearded face into her dark hair. He held her with a desperate, holy reverence, letting her tears soak completely through his shirt, offering her the absolute, unyielding safety to mourn that neither of them had ever been granted. In the sweltering heat of the stone keep, as the shrieking blizzard battered the mountain outside, the mute giant and the grieving maid clung to each other, their shared scars forging an absolute, unbreakable iron bond in the dark. Which country you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below. That absolute, unbreakable iron bond forged in the freezing dark of the stone keep held incredibly fast as the brutal mountain winter finally began to surrender to the violent, roaring thaw of late April. The meltwater did not merely trickle down the jagged face of the granite peaks, it roared. Rushing cataracts of black, icy slush tore through the deep ravines, carrying the sharp, rich scent of crushed pine needles, damp, exposed earth, and the happy, humid promise of spring. Inside the massive cavern, the suffocating, heavy silence of trauma had been systematically, beautifully dismantled. Nellie was no longer fragile, shivering ghost-jumping shadows. Under Gideon's signed, watchful, and tensely protective gaze, the hollows of her cheeks have filled out, her dark eyes have regained a fierce, quiet spike, and the crippling terror of the ranch had faded into a distant, dull ache. It was a crisp, brilliantly cool Thursday morning. The air inside the keep was sweltering and smelled of hot, clean cotton and the rich, bubbling pot of black chicory coffee sitting on the hearth. Nellie stood at the heavy oak table, using a smooth river stone to meticulously grind dried wild mint into a fine powder. Across the swept-stone floor, Gideon sat in the low timber stool, his mustard, heavily swelled hands drying an oiled clot of the lever-action mechanism of his heavy Winchester rifle. The rhythmic, metallic snick-clack of depleting mystic, comforting sound in their shared sanctuary. Crack! The sound was utterly foreign. A sharp, fat, metallic detonation hastily said the serene meek of the mountain. Before Nagy in flinch, a heavy slug shattered the thick wind shutter of the front window, tearing through the heavy spruce logs in a shower of jagged, lethal splinters. The beat slammed directly to the great wall inches from Nellie's head, exploding in a shower of pounded rock and flattening into a twisted disk of hot lead on the floorboards. Gideon moved before the deafening echo of the gunshot heave and fade from the gorge. He dropped the oiled cloth. He lunged across the sweeping stone floor, his massive frame moving with a terrifying, explosive speed, tackling May to the raw earth just as setting flat brute off through the heavy wooden door. Lands. The voice that floated over the rushing wind outside made Nellie's stomach violently heave, the taste of morning chicory turning to pure, acidic bile in her mouth. It was Abner Vance. It was the voice of the freezing mouth, of the cruel laughter, of the tyrant who locked her in pitch-black stool while their brother's body lay in the freezing clay. "Come out, Cross!" Abner screamed, his voice thick with an ugly, desperate greed, amplified by the safety of the dense, melting tree line. "You stole my property, you feral, mute beast. Send the scullery maid out here." Gideon rode off Nellie, keeping his massive body low to the stall floor. His pale, amber eyes were entirely wild, feral, and blazing the terrifying, holy wrath. The gentle, sullen protector was gone. The terrifying fertility of the beaks had Frau Mutter to defend his den. "Listen to me, Cross," Abner shouted, the sharp clack of lever-action rifles echoing as his hired posse took their positions in the slush. The brat's dead brother had a legal land deed in his name back east. 50 acres of prime rear bottom land in Ohio. With the boy dead, the deed passes entirely to the sister. Though she meets a tragic, unfortunate end in righteous, the deed falls to her last legal guardian. "Tui," Nay's breath caught painfully in her throat. "Tosses hin Ayrtons." The cruel, wealthy tyrant hadn't tracked her up the treacherous mountain out of a bruised ego over a lost maid. He had come to murder her for a piece of paper. "I let you in the dark once, Nellie." Abner's voice dripped with a malicious, sickening venom. "Come out. I'll put you in a pine box underground where you can cry for eternity." Gideon did not look at the door. He looked down at Nellie. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand gripping her shoulder with an iron, reassuring squeeze. He did not need a voice to make a vow. His eyes burned with an absolute, lethal promise. No one ever lock you in the dark again. Gideon rose into a crouch. He grabbed the Winchester. He reached for a barreled shot .50 to 90 buffalo rifle resting against the mantel, and wasted his dull and iron fang axe over his broad shoulder. He pointed a thick finger at Nellie, commanding her to stay low behind the heavy oak table. Then the giant slipped into the deep, pitch-black shadows at the very rear of the cave system, disappearing entirely into a narrow, hidden fissure that led directly up to the ridge above the front porch. The yard became a chaotic, swirling nightmare of acrid sulfur, quarter blood, and raw, visceral violence. Boom! The roar of the massive Sharp's rifle from the high ridge was utterly deafening, a concussive shockwave that physically shook the heavy spruce logs of the cabin. Gun, 30 yards away as rifle raised, the brunt of the massive, heavy-grain lead slug directly in the center of his chest. A Canuti force punched him backward at his feet, launching through the atlant that and the freezing, muddy slosh. Gave that stab the rage. The visage to the tense, melting timber like a vengeful, saddened ghost. He moved through the slush with a terrifying, unnatural speed. He met the flanking mercenaries before he even located the source of the smoke. Gian swung the 80 axe in brutal, horizontal arcs. The heavy iron bit through heavy winter coats and crushed ribs with sicking, wet crunches, sister with a green knocking an anhud dare to bring vyings to a century. But in his feral, blood-soaked assault, the giant had been drawn down the steep slope, 50 yards away from the stone keep. Admiral Vance had not joined the charge in the mud. He was a Gayward who fought a wing in the week. While gang decimated the hired gang in Tier, while fictitiously as mercenaries, a foofy, hesper smelling a stale rye whiskey wet wall, had managed to scale the side of the cave face, slipping onto the happy timber roof of the front porch. Inside the cavern, Nay crouched beside the massive stone hearth, hands trembling violently. She had the deafening cracks of gunfire outside, a metallic-scented black pod drifting heavily to the shatty front window. Then she heard the loud, unmistakable screech of the happy, iron-barred roof shutter of the front window front convoy to Pride Park. Not outside, inside. Nay froze. She watched in absolute terror as the mercenary kicked the splitted wood inward, dropping heavily onto the swept stone floor of the cavern. He leveled the rusted, heavy-caliber revolver directly, his lips peeling back in a rotten, yellow grin. Well, the mercenary sneered, stepping closer, his boots checking filthy gnat and mud onto her clean-stand Thor. Look at the little weeping Willie. The boss said he would have cried. Let's scream for the mute sobbed. Go. Maybe he'll hear you before I blow your brains out. He took a step toward her, the gun aimed directly at her chest. He expected her to car. He expected a fragile, breaker made to collapse to a stone, weeping upon him with terror. Nelly he not weep. She'd the my here contumerior for a piece of paper. A man that presents the needs outside true, vain society that ignored her dying bond. The suffocating, ingrained terror of the pitch-black barn vanished entirely, completely incinerated by a blinding, white-hot inferno of absolute, protected rage. She was not a helpless scary maid. She was Gideon Cross's Warren. Nellie did not reach for the heavy hunting knife on the terror. Her hands were not trained for a blade. Instead, she fell backward slightly, her right hand sweeping down directly into the glowing, blistering hot coals of the massive stone heart. Resting deep within the absolute hottest, deepest part of the fire was a massive, solid iron branding tool Gideon used to mark his felled timber. The heavy iron shaft was blistering, the thick, heavy-leaded tip glowing a translucent, cherry red, radiating a lethal, searing wave of intense heat. The mercenary lunged forward to grab her dark hair. She swung. Nellie channeled every single ounce of her fury, her accumulated grief, and the raw, unadulterated strength she had built over a lifetime of scrubbing raw pine and holding freezing water. She pivoted her heel and brought her massive, blistering iron brand out from her side in a brutal, desperate, two-handed upward arc, putting the full, substantial dimension through her tie body into the low. Croak hiss. The heavy, blowing iron flight of the scalding brine slammed directly into the side of the mercenary's spines, cutting him squarely across the cheekbone and jaw. The superheated, cherry-red iron seared instantly through his flesh, vaporizing the skin and muscle beneath with a horrific, violent sizzle that filled the cavern with the dense, acrid, sickening stitch of burning hair and meat. The inbent Shechidov's cheekbone with a loud, wet crunch. The man didn't just scream. He shrieked. A high, inhuman, piercing wail of absolute, paralyzing agony that tore his vocal cords. The rested revolver flew from his deadened, no-shut grip, fluttering uselessly against the stone half. He collapsed completely backward, crashing heavily to a dirt floor, clutching his ruined, smoking face, weeping, vomiting, and thrashing blindly in the dust. Nay, starving, her chest heaving, the breath hissing aggressively through tea. Her calloused knuckles were stalk white around her lithe right handle of the heavy iron path, rain in frotting saps, the blistering iron tips still radiating intense, lethal heat. She looked wild. She looked terrifying. She looked down at the screaming, rising killer, her absolute, unbreakable strength reigning supreme over his pathetic, deafening agony. The shattered front door was suddenly filled with a massive, looming, blood-soaked shadow. Gidding burst back into the room. He was a terrifying vision of absolute, feral carnage. His chest was heaving, his canvas shirt completely soaked in the blood of the posse outside. The heavy felling axe in his hand dripped thick crimson onto the pristine stone. His pale, amber eyes were wild with panic, expectant to find her bleeding on the floor. He looked at the shattered side window. He to the screaming, smoking killer thrashing in the dirt. And he to Nellie. She still tell, the heavy, smoking hand weapon still raised firmly in her crippled hand, her face flushed with exertion, her dark eyes blazing the fierce, untamed, magnificent fire. She met a shocked gaze, her breathing ragged but entirely steady. An unspoken, silent roar of absolute defiance echoed loudly in sweltering air of the cavern. Gained might speak. He stumped forward, grabbed the screaming, moved mercilessly by the car of his spawning coat, and dragged him violently or a fanfare, hurrying him fair to the porch to topple down the rocky, slush-covered slope to join the remnants of Navance's slaughtered posse. The sickening, wet, tumbling crunch of the mercenary's heavy body hitting the jagged, slush-covered granite at the bottom of the ravine echoed faintly over the howling mountain wind, followed immediately by the frantic, panicked scrambling of the surviving hired guns. The men could still dry breath around shattered ribs and crushed chests, ruddy feeding blindly down the treacherous, melting switchbacks, abandoning their horses, their weapons, and the worthy tyrant who had bought into the slaughter. At Navant, the arrogant rancher who had locked a grieving girl in the freezing dark, lay entirely broken and lifeless at the base of the gorge, his luxurious furland coat completely soaked in freezing mud and his cruel, untouchable empire permanently extinguished by the mountain's fountain. Gideon sting on the edge of the Hebe-Tingwa porch, a towering, blood-soaked monument against the blinding white glare of the morning snow. The feral, terrifying adrenaline it fueled his rock instantly evaporated into the freezing air, leaving a crushing, hollow exhaustion in its wake. The freezing wind battered his massive chest, exposed through the shredded, blood-soaked ribbons of his canvas shirt, whom the thick cord muscles tight to his heavy, bruised ribs. He toned sigh, his having iron boots dragging across the sosh-covered stone, his stop like a zushel into his sweltering, swake-filled heat to the cavern. Knees to him actually centered the swake stone through. Her chest was heaving with exertion, her dark hair falling wildly around her shoulders. She opened her trembling hands. The messy, smoking cast-iron branding tool slipped from her grip, hitting stone floor with loud, dull clink, the blistering metal hissing violently as it cooed against the rock, filling the room with the acrid scent of barn dust and hosor. She didn't hesitate. She didn't shrink away from the wall-coating's massive hounds, or the wild, untamed violence that still radiated in heavy, suffocating waves from his towering frame. She hurried to him, her soft, calloused hands reaching out to press directly against his heaving, blood-stained chest. He and not the heavy double-bitted felling axe dropped for his grip, and hit the stone with a dense vod. He allowed her to guide into the heavy wooden bench beside the scout oak tail, sinking into the thick ting with heavy, exhausted groan rattled T-Bing's lungs. Nellie fetched the tin wash basin, filling it from the heavy iron kettle that still steamed on the stone half. She grabbed a clean, soft linen rack and a cake of harsh lye soap. She returned to his side, her hands moving the precious, desperate urgency. She washed the thick, drying water of the black, acrid soot of the gunpowder from the skin. Pee and hissed as the hot water his shallow, weeping graze across his thick-left bicep, his massive hands gripping the edge of the heavy oak table until his thick knuckles turned a stark, bone white, but he didn't pull away. He didn't poke at the wound. He lit his hands. He looked at the delicate, work-ruined fingers that just wielded boiling iron to police the man who had come to murder. His pale hand eyes darkened with a profound, agonizing guilt. He reached up, his massive, heavily calloused fingers gently wrapping round her wrists, stopping the movement of the wet ride. He gently pushed her hands away. He stood up, walking with a heavy, dragging limp to the massive stone hearth. He reached down to the sweeping latch and peeked at the thick, cooled piece of blood charcoal. He jumped to one knee, the stone floor trembling under his weight. He pushed the charcoal directly against the smooth, flat ant stone. His movements were frantic, joined by desperate, self-loathing terror, the harsh scraping sound of the burnt wood echoing loudly in the quiet cavern. He wrote in blood, jagged letters, "Vance is dead. You save." He paused, his massive chest heaving, his amber eyes swinging with an unspeakable, suffocating greed. He pressed the charcoal to the stone again, pressing so hard the tip of the word snout off. "The Ohio deed is yours. You a worthy woman. Take the stagecoach east. Buy a grand house. Be safe in the light." He stood up, pointing a trembling, thick finger at the words in stone, and then gestured wildly to the heavy timber door. He pointed to a threadbare dress, into his own blood-soaked, heavily scarred chest, shaking his massive head violently. With absolute, terrifying signs conveying us it clearer than they spoken plea. "You witch now. You do hope to living free in cave with the mute, violent beast who brings slaughter to your door. Go to the civilized world and be free." Nellie stared at the dark, jagged words on the stone. Shoot the giant, reading the profound, earth-shattering sacrifice his amber eyes. He was willing to send away the only lies dark world have known, simply because he believed this earth better and broken worst. Nellie's world hammered a frantic, terrified ream a gift for Reese, baby ream fee. His blinding, white-hot surge of absolute, unyielding love. She walked out to the mercenary's discard, burning coat lying near the shattered window. She reached into the inside pocket, pulling free the fard, a parchment transfer deed of the Vance had sent his men to force her to sign. It was the legal claim to 50 acres via bottom line. It was a king's ransom, the ultimate key to a life of unimaginable ease where she would not be forced to scrub a floor or freeze in the barn again. Nellie walked directly to the blazing stone hearth. With half a single second of hesitation, she held the priceless parchment directly into the center of the roaring flames. The dry paper caught instantly. It flared bright, blindly on, curling blacklings of fortune hasting land with hastily vaporized into completely worthless, drifting wraith ash. Gideon's hives flew hard open. His massive jaw hopped, the breath rushing from his lungs in a stunned, disbelieving exhale, his hands reaching out as if to stop the burning. Nellie didn't stop there. She grabbed the heavy linen wash rag from the tin basin. She dropped to her knees in front of the smooth granite earth zone. With 3 forceful, deliberate swipes of the wet rag, she washed the charcoal was completely away, erasing a sacrifice from the stand rail. She stood up, throwing the wet rag onto the floorboards. The bright, morning light framed her silhouette, but she did not look like a fragile, grieving scholarly maid. She looked like the fierce, absolute matriarch of the mountain. Freedom from what? Nay demanded, closing the distance between them with steady, undeniable purpose. "From you, from the only mind who heard me leaping the pit but cold and tore both in down to Sydney." She walked right up to him, invading space, forcing the towering giant to down her feast tea-filled eyes. "You think a piece of paper and train ticket makes me save?" Nellie asked, her voice trembling with an oiling, consuming motion that tore the fair vein build. "I lived in a civilized woo, game, and they looked me free from cage with the arms because I did to cry for my dead brother. They punished me for having a heart in the light. I don't want a civilized light. I don't want a civilized man." She reached out, grabbing a thick canvas a open, blood-stained shirt, and yanked down every ounce of her restored string. He stumbled, his knees giving way under the sheer, ant-baiting force of her conviction. He fell heavily to his knees while the sweat stood thaw, his massive, heavily bent face going level with her waist. "I'm not leaving the dark. Nellie whispered fiercely, her soft, warm hands coming up to gently cradle his massive, bearded, scared face. She didn't flinch from the blade. She pressed her palms directly against his cheeks, pulling his head forward until his forehead rested gently against her stomach. "I'm staying right here, Gideon." With here, Gideon broke the heavy iron walls he built around his soul for 2 decades. The punishing, mute isolation he had sentenced himself to in the frozen peaks to hide from his own unspeakable trauma, shattered into fine, unrecognizable dust. A ragged, choking sob ripped out of his massive chest, a sound of such profound, agonizing release it physically shook the stone floor beneath them. He wrapped his thick, powerful arms entirely around their hips, burying his scarred face deeper into the soft, warm curve of her stomach, holding to her with a desperate, holy reverence. Nellie held him, her fingers gently stroking his thick, dark hair, feeling the violent trembling of his broad shoulders. Then the giant pulled back just an inch. He looked up into her eyes, his amber gaze swimming with tears. He reached his messy, calloused hand up, pressing his thick fingers fiercely against the brutal, jagged scar that slashed Garza's throat. He closed his eyes, his massive chest heaving as he garggled 2 decades as a brust mutilated brack. The muscles in his thick neck called it and strained violently. He forced the ruined, severed cords in his throat to vibrate, fighting past a lifetime of obsolete, terrified silence. The sound that tore from his throat was barely a whisper. It was a deep, gravelly, impossibly rough scrape sang, like 2 heavy stones grinding together in the earth. That intertwined of the island, it was the lilest, most voice-shuddering sound that he had ever heard. Mind, gleaned rice. The single, agonizingly fought for word hung in the sweltering air, an absolute, unshakable vow of eternal protection and claiming. Nellie gasped, hot tears spilling freely down her cheeks. She leaned forward and pressed her mouth directly against his, a kiss of absolute, holy devotion, worshipping the very man the world had deemed the sullen, broken youngster. He held her there in the ruins of the fight, the cold wind blowing through the shattered timber, the fire popping warmly in the massive stone hearth. The ashes of a fortune lay completely forgotten in the grate. It is gain cross Foster's rude voice to claim the one who had chosen scarred darkness. He knew with absolute, untiable certainty the nabbing wager. The night saw sawing the Jagger peaks with a brain blind warm, towing the mar grunt to the one heaven happy hell pine looming half law. The massive stone keep had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a dark, brooding cave built for a solitary beast to hide his scars. The heighty spruce logs had been meticulously oiled, and the stone swept cane. A wide, wraparound porch of smooth sanded cedar had been built out of the cliff face, catching the warm sun drifts. The shattered front windows had been replaced with clear, polished bells to let morning light flood the interior. The heavy scent of isolation was entirely gone, replaced by the constant, sweet aroma of baking bread, drying wild mint, and fresh pine shavings. On the porch, sitting on the heavy, wide-back timber bench, was Gideon. He wore a clean canvas shirt, the sleeves rolled to expose his thick, heavily muscled forearms. The cold, pale, tear-wreathed amber eyes had been permanently replaced by a wan, watchful, and grabby deep peace. He was carving a small, incredibly detailed wooden horse from a block of soft pine. Sitting entirely between his massive, booted feet on the porch boards was a plump, giggling 3-year-old boy with a mop of thick, dark hair and bright amber eyes, attempting with absolute determination to stack 3 small pebbles on top of each other. The heavy, iron-bound oak door creaked open. Nellie stepped out onto the porch. She wore a dress of soft, light blue cotton, the collar open loose. The fragile, exhausted, grieving scholarly maid from the freezing barn was a distant, unrecognizable memory. She was radiantly, beautifully healthy, her dark hair pinned loosely up, catching the golden sunlight. She walked to wine, carrying steamed tin cup of dark chicory coffee. She moved with docile, unshakable offerings, undemeaned with the grace of an absolute queen. She walked beside a tintenenge, ongain the cock, and rested her hand lightly on his broad shoulder, leaning down to press a soft kiss to the scarred skin of his neck. Gideon took the cup, but his nesek hand immediately came up to cover his resting in the shoulder. His thumb gently stroked her knuckles. He did not speak. His throat was too ruined for casual conversation, but he didn't need to. His eyes held absolute volumes of worship. The wind is soft today, Nellie smiled, her dark eyes sparkling as she looked out over the whispering pines, watching their son finally balance the third pebble and let out a triumphant shriek. Gideon nodded slowly, a deep, rich rumble of amusement vibrating in his massive chest. He turned his head, capturing her lips in a soft, lingering kiss, tasting the sweet wild mint in the crisp mountain air. He didn't just kiss her. He held her hand tightly, laying his head back against her arm, surrounded by the absolute unbroken peace they had built together. They stayed together on the porch, looking out over the jagged, beautiful wilderness that had once been a prison grief for both of them. Far below, where the valley opened up, the mud, the cruelty of events, and the suffocating dark of the barn they had since washed away, utterly forgotten. I've been the rage, bathed in the rich light of the afternoon sun, the jay thing has made your outcast other than the mother. They would get thee safe, wildly loved, and entirely, perfectly free.